Good evening. Good evening. We're going to get started. My name is Ingrid Lofgren. I am from the Department of Nutrition and Food Sciences here at the University of Rhode Island. I'd like to thank everyone who is here in person, as well as everyone who's joining us virtually for coming tonight. We greatly appreciate it. I'm going to do some housekeeping things to start. So basically, just want to point out where we have our exits. We have exits at the back. We also have exits on either side of the stage. We have unisex bathrooms when you go out to the left in the lobby. We ask you to silence your phones and no photos or camera recording during the event. I would like to introduce Nakai Clearwater Northrup, educator at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Mashantucket and Narragansett, and he is going to be doing our land acknowledgement.
Sure. Good evening. My name is Nakai Clearwater Northup. I'm a member of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribe and Narragansett Nation. I serve as the head of education at the Pequot Museum, and I'm honored to be here with you tonight. I want to say Weepiankwa, which in my language means come in a good way, welcoming you guys to this space. This is the Aboriginal lands of my people, the Narragansett people, and it's an honor to be here. And for the sake of what you guys got going on and community, it's really an indigenous style of life. And we take lessons from nature, we take lessons from the land around us, and they teach us. And the land is something really important and something that we need to steward and protect, because one day we'll all become land. Our ancestors are the land, so it's our duty to be there for it. So again, thank you guys for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure, and you guys enjoy the rest of your night.
So the University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. We honor and respect the enduring and continuing relationship between the indigenous people and this land by teaching and learning more about their history and present-day communities, and by becoming stewards of the land we now too inhabit. So I'm very happy and honored to be able to introduce Dr. Ashanté Reese. Dr. Reese is a writer, a teacher, an anthropologist, a yogi, and someone who's very interested in laughter and likes to laugh with her whole body. She earned a PhD in anthropology from American University and a Bachelor of Arts in History with a minor in African American Studies from Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. She's an assistant professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Broadly speaking, Dr. Reese works at the intersection of critical food studies and Black geographies, examining the ways Black people produce and navigate food-related spaces despite anti-Blackness. Animated by the question, who and what survives, much of Dr. Reese's work has focused on everyday strategies Black people employ while navigating inequity. Dr. Reese's first book, Black Food Geographies, Race, Self-Reliance, and Food Access in Washington, D.C., takes up these themes through an ethnographic exploration of anti-Blackness and food access. It was awarded the 2020 Margaret Mead Award, which is jointly awarded by the Association of American Anthropologists and the Society for Applied Anthropology. Black Food Geographies was also awarded the 2020 Best Monograph Prize by the Association for the Study of Food and Society. And most recently, she has released a co-edited book of essays with Hannah Garth entitled Black Food Matters, Racial Justice in the Wake of Food Justice, that explores the geographic, social, and cultural dimensions of food in Black life across the U.S. Black Food Matters received an honorable mention recognition for the Eduardo Bonilla Silva Outstanding Book Award by the Division of Racial and Ethnic Minorities of the Society for the Study of Social Problems. Dr. Reese's work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, which is now the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, UNCF Mellon, and the American Council for Learned Society, among others. She has published in academic and public-facing venues such as Human Geography, the Oxford American, Gravy Magazine, and Civil Eats. And something that I really like from Dr. Reese's syllabus is she puts a statement in about grace. And one of the things I thought was really central to what we're doing tonight is that grace is an invitation to think and be in possibility together, which is, I think, what we'll be doing tonight with Dr. Reese. Dr. Reese?
Hi, everybody. Okay, that's much better. So I was so happy to hear the line about that I love laughing with my whole body, because maybe I'll make you laugh a couple of times tonight. There are so many people to thank. I am almost afraid to call names because I'm going to miss someone. So everyone who was engaged with bringing me here, thank you. And special thanks to, I don't know where you went, to the president for allowing me to stay with you and your wife, Mary. I don't know where you went. Thank you. And also, let me tell you something. This is only my second visit back to a campus since COVID started. Everything else has been virtual. And y'all win, okay? I've had the best host since I've been here, and I don't know when it was, Ingrid, maybe 3 months ago, you sent me a sweatshirt in the mail because I had said the best visit I'd had, someone had given me a sweatshirt, and here I come getting a sweatshirt before I got here. So, kudos to y'all. You've got that down. So my talk today is titles here on the slide. And I just want to preface this by saying I actually crafted this talk as a series of notes. And part of why I did this is because, one, I knew there would be a lot of students here. So I wanted to think through what could be important to different constituents who might be in the room. But also, having been doing this work for 13 or so years at this point, it felt like a really great time to pause and think about what have I learned and what has changed in my own thinking, which I think for students, you don't all get to see the fact that we went from point A to point B to point C. You often see the end goal. So I actually wanted to model some of what it looks like for one's thinking to change over time. So we'll get started. In 2010, the reality TV show Too Fat for 15, Fighting Back, premiered on the Style Network. At the time, I was a graduate student and someone who was very interested in discourses around obesity and food, so I watched it religiously, taken in by the individual narratives and the triumph stories. Over the course of 2 seasons, the show documented the weight loss journey of adolescents at Wellsprings Academy, a boarding school where students spent anywhere from 1 summer to several semesters as they tried to make lifestyle changes that would lead to significant weight loss. According to the show, Wellspring was run similarly to a boot camp. Initially, students could only make 2 30-minute phone calls a week. Every low-fat meal and snack and physical activity was planned by the staff. Their weight gain or weight loss was tracked through regular weigh-ins, and when they had an opportunity to go home or to see their families, counselors checked in with each student regularly. Sometimes they would actually travel to check in with these students to make sure that they were still on track. Any student who was at least 30 pounds overweight could apply to attend Wellspring, but the show focused on the kids who were classified as morbidly obese. One of those teens was Tanisha, who you see on the screen. She was 17 years old at the time, an African-American teenager from Suitland, Maryland, and she was clearly the fan favorite. Her Facebook page included a mix of words of inspiration and words of adoration, and it was so easy to see why people would love her. She rarely complained. Her positive attitude was evident in her desire and her ability to overcome injury, and she celebrated every milestone. At the beginning of season 1, Tanisha had to be driven to the dining hall for every meal because she couldn't walk up the hill that was required to access the dining hall. By mid-season, she tackled the hill and everyone applauded, including me, from my home. In season 2, Tanisha successfully completed a team triathlon, again, amazing her peers and her fans. And by the time she left Wellspring Academy, or at least by the time the show was over, she had lost over 200 pounds. So I start with this narrative about Tanisha, not because she was a resounding success story, which I think many people who watched the show thought that she was, but because of how her story and the show more broadly displayed many aspects of our national obsession with food that was in part a byproduct of the panic around childhood obesity at the time. Tanisha was the perfect subject of what many in the general public and some in health professions believed about Black people in particular. That our bodies need to be controlled because they're already deficient, that we should be surveilled, and that there always needs to be some form of outside help. It also solidified what seems to be a hard to untangle public narrative that equates Blackness to poorness and uneducated. And of all the students enrolled in season 2, Tanisha is the only student who had her socioeconomic status revealed on the show, and whose background was explored in depth. As a result of that, her mother, in fact, was the target of hate mail and messages that ranged from calling her irresponsible to accusing her of child abuse, to linking her parenting to disparaging discourses about being a welfare mother. As I studied public and cultural responses to obesity more and more, I was less interested in this question of personal responsibility and more interested in questions about how neighborhoods and cities shape food access. So Black food geographies, which some of you have read, thank you, became something that I didn't plan, which is probably true for a lot of our research projects. In the early days of the work, I had planned to think quite explicitly about what people were eating. I had planned to spend time in people's kitchens, going on shopping trips with them, sitting at their dining room tables. In essence, I was thinking about what food looked like across spatial registers, from the kitchen to the dining table to the grocery store to the neighborhood. And I also wanted to know where and when this created dissonance across these distinct spaces for people and their everyday lives. So I didn't do that project, and if you're a student in the room, you should do that project because it's a good one. You're welcome. It's still a valuable thing, but what shifted my project for me were all these questions and all these ways that people that I had approached assumed that I was there to teach them how to eat better, critique what they were eating, or somehow just give them knowledge that they did not have. And what that ended up meaning for me was actually a little bit of a broken heart, because most of these people that I were engaging, they were parents, but they were also elders, and they assumed that I was coming in to tell them that they were doing something wrong. And so I shifted a lot of my thinking to just ask, what is it that you want me to know? And so that led to a lot of really interesting questions. So I started to read a lot more outside of food studies, and in the first 4 months, one of the things that came up was this idea of self-reliance. That this, alongside a really uncomfortable reality for me that people were really not ready or not expecting me to come and engage the positive aspects of their lives, changed the way I thought about food access and changed the way that I was thinking about the neighborhood. And I started thinking more about navigating. What were all the ways that people were navigating this space? So this brought me to this. So as you can see, I don't know if I can make this a laser. Okay, so you may not be able to see this because this is really bright. But at the time, race and racism were an important part of critical food studies, but it was considered just that, a part, right? And there was people were studying global agribusiness and transnational corporations and the alternative food movement. And what I became really interested in part sparked by what I was watching on Too Fat for 15, was actually not how race and racism were only a part of the food system, but how we might consider anti-Blackness or racism more broadly as the weather, as what actually envelops the entire food system. So rather than thinking about it as an optional part of thinking about the food system, thinking about it as an inevitable. That actually the racism that we're experiencing, whether it's related to education or policing or whatever, is the same thing that we're experiencing when we're talking about the food system. So this gives you a little bit of a snapshot of the work I was doing in DC. Deanwood, the neighborhood I was researching, was in Ward 7. At the time, these were the supermarkets that I had in 2010. There were 4 of them. There were 2 in 2016. Actually, there's only 1 now. 1 has closed as of 2019. And you can also see the different income disparities and the percent Black and percent white of each of these wards. DC, like a lot of other urban areas in the country, is highly segregated along race lines and race and class, at the intersection of race and class. Happy to talk about this a little bit more. But one thing you can see is that the neighborhood that had the most supermarkets in 2016 also had the highest number of planned supermarkets, right? So this gives us the concept that supermarket access isn't primarily about need, right? One other thing I should also mention is Ward 7 is one of the Ward 7 and Ward 8 combined are east of the Anacostia River. There's about 150,000 residents. So if you think about east of the river at the time, 3 supermarkets to serve 150,000 people. So that is where the context in which I was doing the work. But I didn't want to only think about supermarkets. I actually wanted to think about how supermarkets were a part of this larger thing that I called Black food geographies, which I break down into 3 kind of big buckets. And one of them is around the emotional and nostalgic dimensions of accessing food. This was particularly important in this neighborhood where there were some people whose families had been there 2, 3 generations. And so and elders had memories of what the neighborhood looked like before the kind of current day food access issues. And then there's the navigating thing that I pointed out already, which is what are all the ways that people were navigating the urban landscape? One of the things that I write about in the book, for example, is how were people making decisions between traveling to the closest supermarket versus using a corner store, for example. And sometimes that decision was made based on whether or not someone had transportation. So that would fit into this navigation bucket. And then the last thing that I think is really important, which is how were people either altering their neighborhood through urban agriculture, for example, or how were they transgressing the bounded nature of how we think about neighborhoods? In other words, we have invisible boundaries, often census tracts, that tell us this is your neighborhood, this is my neighborhood, that's someone else's neighborhood over there. Well, how are people actually thinking about that in their daily lives? Most people don't just live in the boundaries of their neighborhood. So I was interested in how people were making decisions about where they would go. So all of this project, where I started, was really rooted in this question of access. And so when I look back on that, I think about how, for me, that was a social justice imperative, but it was also one that I hadn't really connected to larger dreams of freedom or liberation. So lately, in the last several years, but certainly in the last year or so, I've been thinking about what it means to think and write beyond this framework of access. I have in the past been really hesitant to talk about what I think the solutions to a problem should be. So when I visited a class today, students asked me, so what do we do? And I could feel myself seizing up, right? Because I think the question of what do we do is a collective question. And I often feel really uncomfortable about having answers to that as an individual. But I also have taken this, what I would say a privilege and a responsibility of being a researcher who's been in this field for a while. I'm starting to try to rethink my hesitancy and take more seriously the privilege of being asked the question what we should do. So I have a few thoughts to share with us tonight. So, note 1, failure is an opportunity. This is gonna sound a little bit like a sermon because both of my dads are preachers, so you're just gonna have to bear with me, okay? Note 1, failure is an opportunity. So, when my book was in press, I had a mentor who said to me, she's asking me about my next project, and I was like, I'm not sure, I'm still trying to figure it out. And she says, well, if you want to know what your next project is, look for the failure in your first book. And I said, well, my first book is not out yet. I'm not ready to think about it as a failure, thank you. But she said, no, she wanted me to think about failure as an opportunity. And so later I thought about this as a critique of perfectionism, yes, but also an invitation to be thoughtful about opening up to the ideas that there could be opportunities or threads that I had not fully explored in my early work that I might want to pick up later. So now what I think of as the failure read opportunity is actually the way that I thought about access. So I want to pause here and say, there's on the screen, there's this big wording that says against access. And what I mean here is I'm not against access as an imperative or as a thoughtful way to think about getting people what they need. If you were to ask anyone in Deanwood today what they would want in their food system, I would be very surprised if at least 8 out of 10 people didn't say that they wanted a supermarket, right? People deserve and they want access to the things that they need. But I think what we've seen over the past 30 years since the term food desert entered into our lexicon is that conversations about expanding access have easily and sometimes dangerously been conflated with conversations about health and well-being more broadly. And that these metrics that we use to measure health and well-being are driven not necessarily by values, but often by numbers. While the emphasis on the built environment is meant to shift us away from individual responsibility, it actually can have the opposite impact by implicitly assuming that the environment just simply acts on people and that people are objects and not agents in our environments. Neighborhoods with poor food access, obviously, as I showed you, reflect race and class inequities that are related to food, but they're also beyond food. And so if we think about just putting a supermarket there and presume that they will come, it runs the risk of treating people not only as movable objects, but also it runs the risk of stigmatizing and alienating them if they don't choose or cannot choose those resources for whatever reason. One thing that interventions in urban food justice have gotten right is that the built environment is important. One thing that we can do better, and I'm including myself in this we, is to work from an assumption that all environments are always co-created, they're always co-constituted by their use and non-use, and even people who might be on the receiving end of a problem can be instrumental in solving that problem. When we think about this use and non-use of environment, it's not only driven by access. There are things like desire and cultural preferences, for example, that are equally important. So we have to take those things that are sometimes unmeasurable and messy into account when we're trying to build a better food system, and I would think a better world. So what I'm suggesting here is that pushing back against access as the singular or even most important framework through which to understand nourishment is one way of saying, what if we thought about nourishing whole lives and not just biological bodies? In her book, Food in Cuba, Hannah Garth offers what she calls the politics of adequacy as a framework for helping us connect the spatial politics of food insecurity to the socio-political context in which it merges, to the actual desires of those who are navigating that insecurity. So she asks us these questions. What makes a food provisioning system adequate? And adequate to what ends? I would add adequate to whose ends? By complicating adequacy, Hannah Garth forces us to question, what is it exactly that we're fighting for? Are we fighting for access? Are we fighting for a standardized version of healthiness? Are we fighting for people's rights to live a full, healthy, nourished life, even if it's the life that we wouldn't choose for them? Hannah Garth's work extends. We both edited Black Food Matters, and in the chapter that she wrote, she makes this conundrum really clear. So she opens with this story about working in an LA-based food justice organization that primarily worked with Black and Latinx youth. And as she was working with these youth, she was participating in an event that the organization had put on, and everyone was asked to share what their favorite food was. So the kids go around sharing their favorite food. They get to Hannah, and Hannah says macaroni and cheese. And so at the end of the event, you know, she thinks it goes well, and one of the leaders pulls her aside and says, hey, I wanted to talk to you about what you shared was your favorite food. And Hannah was like, yeah, macaroni and cheese. It's great. I have a good recipe. And the woman says to her, we're actually trying to get the kids to change the way that they eat. We don't want them to come in saying that they like things like tortillas or macaroni and cheese as their favorite foods. So the next time we do this, just say your favorite food is something like kale, okay? So here, this little anecdote that Hannah shares is really instructive of Julie Guthman's observations that sometimes organizations' good intentions can lead to bringing whitened cultural histories that don't reflect the realities of the people that they're working with. And even with good intentions, it can undermine different and sometimes competing visions for what it means to live a good and decent life. In an essay about Black study, Darius Carter writes that writing about Blackness can so easily reduce Black people to idealized historical victims. And I'd like to extend Carter's analysis to our food world. It's not only writing about Blackness that gets reduced to what's legible. It is also the programming that is created for Black folks. It is addressing inequities that impact Black people. It's the struggle that is present and visible in writing proposals for funding, many of which often require that the most radical dreaming about our food system be stripped because those things cannot be measured and they cannot always be done very quickly. But what becomes of food justice if we only render our struggle and our outcomes to what is legible? Actually, I think one thing we might ask is what becomes of our food justice efforts when they become really neoliberal in their approaches, and that our interest in creating full and healthy lives are reduced to a list of what we consider to be healthy and unhealthy. So I think if we're going to consider food justice a movement, and I think it is a movement, it has to be bigger than access. Because if access is at the center of this movement, and if access is our dream, that potentially makes us better consumers, and it might make us healthier workers, but it doesn't necessarily get us free. So for those of us, all of us, who are interested in the capaciousness of what it could mean to live a good and decent life, where would we turn? And I would like for us to think about a couple of things. So the assumption about access is increased access increases healthiness and improves quality of life. All those arrows are kind of going in the same direction, and we assume that those things work together in this way. But I wonder if we had a little bit of a messier schematic, if this might be closer to what we're thinking about when we're trying to create food justice freedom dreams. And that might be something like looking at the built environment that includes access, safety. It also includes these things like racial residential segregation, which is a part of what creates the problem in the first place. But what if we looked at those things alongside the cultural and emotional connections that people have to food? Our ancestral foods, the concept of delight, satisfaction, trauma. Some of us have trauma associated with our ancestral foods. And also thought about that alongside these things like improvisation, experimentation, ingenuity, and care. I'm only going to talk about delight tonight. So if you ever want to experience delight, in a way that might be new to you, or you just are like, why would she choose this word? You should go to a Black family reunion, okay? That's my next project. Because when I think of delight, that's where I see people out in some park that they have transformed temporarily into a new space to be with each other. There's food, there's all of these different things. And so as I've been rethinking access, that's the image that's been in my head. How do we capture that kind of energy that comes from those spaces? So I have maybe what might come close. Oh! 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 You can dance in your chair if you want.
All the shorties in the club, let me see you just back it up, drop it down, let me see you just get low, scrub the ground, let me see you just
well, I see some people dancing. Don't be shy.
Wobble, baby, wobble, baby, wobble, baby, wobble, yeah. Wobble, baby.
All right, this is the closest thing to delight. This is an image from my book. You can maybe see what's in the background are public housing projects. These public housing projects were slated to be torn down. They were actually already moving families out at the time that I was doing research here. So you may not be able to see it if you're furthest in the back, but the building that's in the background is already boarded up. So what's in the foreground are all these people. There's a collection, a motley crew of people. There's students from the National Medical Students Association who were doing health screenings here. There are residents, there are children, there are gardeners, and we were all here to celebrate the spring planting season for this community garden. And what I love about this image and what I loved about this garden is that this housing project had some of the worst numbers that you would think of in the city when it came to literacy, when it came to crime, when it came to joblessness. All the negative things that could stigmatize public housing were a part of this place. But when I think about this place, there's that, but I think about this moment where there is a pause for joy, for celebration, for community building, for I would say a practice of interdependence that is happening here. And at the top, there's this quote from one of the gardeners. I'd asked one day, I asked, why would you all still be invested in gardening here when you're being moved, you're being relocated, forcibly relocated? And she looks at me, she's an elder, and she looks at me and she says, so you've been reading things on the internet? And I said, well, yes, and also I know things that are happening in the city. And she says, well, they might try to tear this down, but we won't perish, we'll keep flourishing. And that kind of ethos, I think, is something that we can capture when we look beyond access and when we look beyond measurement. So this expression of joy, and I would say fun and laughter and this gathering, it just transformed this space into something different and something that I think might have been a glimpse at what is possible when people are included in reworking the spaces where they live. So this space also helps us see how the same places that we might consider blighted are the sites for aspiration and dreaming. And so we could ask ourselves a couple of questions. How do we get to a place where everyone's food needs are met not with force, but with care? And I think, again, about this garden where people are really trying to nourish themselves and each other in the context of very real structural violence that is happening within their lives. And then the second question is, how do we anticipate and create conditions for delight? So scholars who are in Black studies often take up imagination, pleasure, and joy as theoretical and embodied frameworks for us to understand Black life and how Black life thrives in spite of anti-Blackness. This work doesn't ignore or excuse violence, but it reminds us, and maybe even demands us, to consider Black life as something that cannot be reduced to violence or lack. Christina Sharp writes that while we might be constituted through and by continued vulnerability to anti-Blackness, we are not only known to ourselves or each other by that violence. In Freedom Dreams, Robin Kelley says that we have to tap into our own individual and collective imaginations and do what all of the earlier generations have done, which is dream. And we must do this because if we do not have visions for what we want to build and only have visions for what we want to tear down, we only end up confused, we may be rudderless and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not only a series of clever maneuvers, but it's a process. And in the process, we must be transformed. So Kelley also tells us that the map to the new world is in the imagination. This radical imagination isn't separate from violence. It's produced right in the midst of it. But we always have to think about how we can practice and imagine otherwise. Sometimes these practices and possibilities are imprecise and unrealized. And here I just want to remark on this imprecision because in social science research, we care about precision. We care about numbers. We care about being able to prove something. But it's the imprecision that reminds us of Black life and Black living as being something that exceeds being able to just count how many people are being fed, count how many calories people are taking in, that there's a capaciousness to Blackness that we can actually imagine and dream of in our food worlds. And besides, if we were going to actually think about this in a really practical way, part of what capitalism and anti-Blackness requires of us is to always be improvising and changing and shifting. And if that is true, how do you even measure improvisation at all? I want to come back to delight. Here, I wish you could see this better. This is a photo of my mother's hands. I took this photo in 2017. In this photo, my mother is making tea cakes. Does anyone know what tea cakes are? I realize I'm in the Northeast, and ooh, you know what tea cakes are? Okay, you don't want me to put you on the spot, so I'll just tell everybody what they are, okay? Tea cakes, something like a sugar cookie, maybe something like a shortbread cookie, but if you're a Southerner, and if you're a Black Southerner in particular, you know what they are, and you know that they're delicious, right? I'm a Southerner, I'm a Black Southerner, I know what they are, I know that they're delicious, just trust me, okay? So my mother is making these right now in this photo. When I went off to college, and then I went off to teach, and then I went to the PhD, and I'm in all these different environments, and then I decide I'm gonna be vegan one day, and then there's another day that I wasn't vegan. It was actually, this is one thing that kept us tethered together. So my mother would bake these cookies, these tea cakes, sometimes like almost the thickness of a very thin biscuit, and she would mail them to me, and she would mail them to my friends. And this is a labor of love that I always think about when I'm thinking about food and food justice. So this is the kind of labor that is not taken up in food justice often, right? My mother baking for me, mailing them to me to keep us connected. But it's precisely this kind of work that helped us be able to nurture connection across geography, across class lines, across worldviews even. And I look at this and I think, this moment when she's making this, she's ecstatic actually. You know, she is joyful. She is delighting in being able to provide this for me. So when I think about delight and this idea of imprecision and how it might inform our movements, I think about this kind of care work. That this kind of care work cannot be, it can't always be numbered, but it created a whole world and a whole dynamic for my mother and me. And this is the kind of practice that undergirds my life, and it's the kind of practice that made my life possible. It's this everyday, mundane practice where I first learned that freedom happens at multiple scales. That what my mother was making in the kitchen offered lessons for how I could live, love, fight, create, and be in this everyday weather of anti-Blackness. In my mother's kitchen, I learned that imagination wasn't always about being fantastical or to dream about faraway lands or to place a premium on a freedom that wasn't already present. I learned that sometimes imagination looked like improvising, and sometimes it looked like baking these cookies for her ambitious girl child who was too far away for her to put her hands on if she needed to. In other words, it was a form of beauty. It was a form of attentiveness. And it was a form of attentiveness that allowed me to move from where I was in East Texas, where I grew up, to all the things that I do out here in the world. So the last thing I want us to think about, this idea of aesthetics and curiosity and delight, and all these things that have nothing to do with how we measure healthiness, is this question of sweetness. So I'm working on this new project that I won't talk a lot about tonight. You can ask me questions about it. But the project is called The Carceral Life of Sugar. And I'm still working with this concept of anti-Blackness and how it shapes life forms and possibilities. But I'm also trying to think about, in these same spaces where anti-Blackness is working, are there useful anti-colonial or decolonial practices that we might draw from? I think there might be. So I'm actually working through a curiosity that I've had about sugar for a long time. And part of what this work is having me do is think about sugar as a very real thing that is a part of our food system, a commodity, and sweetness as something that might actually be a metaphor that we might use as necessary in Black life. Sadia Hartman once made this quote that has gone around it's been around for a few years now. She says, care is the antidote to violence. And so in my project, I'm trying to think through, is there a way we might think about sweetness as an antidote to violence? So as a part of this project, I spent a lot of time baking. And my baking is guided by a couple of questions. What can recipes and baking teach us about embodying an abolitionist praxis in the pursuit of food justice? So this imagining new worlds through food justice. And what can this baking teach us about rupturing violence that surrounds us every day? So when I'm doing these baking experiments, I'm really trying to stretch myself to think about, is there a way that baking can model a certain kind of world making outside of my kitchen? So in this video that you just watched, I was playing with dough, and I am making tea cakes like my mother. And like my mother, I am making them as an offering. She made her tea cakes as an offering for me. But unlike my mother, this offering isn't for people who are living. This offering is for the dead. So I used a recipe from a 1920s cookbook from Imperial Sugar Company, which is the sugar company that I am writing about. Imperial Sugar Company was founded in Sugar Land, Texas, and in the early 20th century, they profited from prison labor, for prisoners who harvested sugarcane that was then refined by the sugar company, and they're created this really complicated, you can ask me questions about it if you want, but created this dynamic between Imperial Sugar Company, the prison system, and Sugar Land, the city itself, such that the histories are so intertwined, it's not even worth untangling them. And in 2018, 95 graves were discovered in Sugar Land at the site of where a new school was being built. And these graves were former prisoners who harvested sugarcane, and some of whom worked for Imperial Sugar Company between around 1895 and 1910. 1910 is when the convict lease system was abolished. So these graves were discovered in Sugar Land, and I started thinking about, how do we honor these folks who were subjected to a certain kind of violence? They would have worked anywhere from 14 to 17 hours a day, doing the labor that they were doing for penance of their crime. And often these crimes were petty crimes, stealing a couple of dollars. There's a list, we now know the names of some of the 95 and the crimes that they were accused for. Of the 78 people that we know, I think only 3 of them were imprisoned because of something like murder. Most of them were theft, some form of petty theft. And if you know anything about the early 20th century, opportunities for Black men, these were mostly Black men there's one woman who's buried in this site, were very limited, right? So even thinking about stealing in that context, we might maybe suspend some of the moral judgment there and think about like what actually made this condition possible. So these 95 graves were discovered, and there's a lot of questions around how do we honor the 95, what would reparations look like? And so in my baking practice, I'm actually taking up this idea of what does it look like to honor them with the sugar made by the same company that caused them violence. And part of why I'm doing this is to think, how do things shift for us when we implicate ourselves as complicit in the violence that is associated with our food system? So I volunteer as tribute, right? And so I work with Imperial Sugar, and I bake, and I make tea cakes, but I make a bunch of other things, and I offer them on an altar to the dead, and then whatever's left I give to the living. So I want us to kind of get back to what I am gesturing toward, which is, I guess I haven't quite named it yet, but my rethinking and rereading and rewriting has brought me to really essentially abandoning access as a framework, but also to really give considerable thought to what nourishment means. And to think about what nourishment means, we have to think about joy and justice and delight and food and the dead and reparations. We've got to think about all those things as somehow connected. And I'm not suggesting that thinking about those things in a connected way is easy. I do it often and it feels really difficult. But what I am suggesting is that in order to serve Black life well, we have got to figure out a way to de-link Black life and food from deficit models that then only seem to reinforce the deficit model itself. I think we can actually do better than that. Sometimes I wonder, I thought about this when I was making this presentation, I wondered what Too Fat for 15, for example, would have looked like if the students or if Tanisha was encouraged to explore what they truly delighted in rather than what they were just being told to stay away from. In other words, is there a way for us to model behavioral change in ways that aren't just about constriction? These are the kinds of questions that I'm thinking through, and they are the kinds of questions that I hope that you leave thinking through as well. I really hope that you didn't think I had answers to these questions. I'm much better at asking questions often than I am answering them, but I think together we can maybe think through some of them, right? Because if we're going to abandon access as a primary framework, that means that we can make space to consider other aspects of living, right? And maybe we can also not be so constrained by what access means, right? That access means that we just add more stuff, but maybe if we don't use that, we can dream of other things. And if we make more space for dreaming, perhaps we can make more space for Black lives to be fuller. They can be greater, they can be grander. And there's a way to do that, and that doesn't reify the idea that Black people's food lives are already at a deficit. So I'm going to thank you there and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much for sharing these thoughts with us. So yes, we can accept questions now from the audience.
Thank you so much for all of this, for the work itself, for the intentionality of being here. I really appreciate so many aspects of how you're thinking through and presenting the work, particularly appreciative of the vibes of Afrofuturism and just imagination being put forward, the pleasure activism of just pleasure and embracing that and thinking about liberation, which can seem so, militant and serious, and thinking about that and thinking it through in the way you've done is so valuable. So my name is Aya. I'm a co-owner of a family-run West African food restaurant that existed in Boston for 15 years until my mom and dad were evicted during the pandemic for being behind in rent, much like many small businesses in the pandemic. Luckily, Rhode Island and Providence welcomed them, and we have been spending the past 2 years reestablishing ourselves in Providence. And I really am leaning on and thinking a lot about experimentation as we reestablish our restaurant and think about what it means to be a restaurant in a community as folks who've been cast aside and finding home in this new community and wanting to really approach it differently from every aspect of our food and our approach and our ecosystem. And so I'm just kind of curious around the experimentation perspective of where you've seen folks experimenting as a business and navigating the capitalistic corporate profit aspect of it, but also being a community agent. If you've seen any examples or just have thoughts or anything on just any guidance towards how to really take on this mission as a business.
Thank you. I'm so sorry to hear that your family got evicted from their space, and I'm happy that y'all were able to regroup because so many businesses have not been able to regroup. So let me start there. So immediately when you asked about experimentation and just, I think what I heard your question. I think underneath the question, what I hear is, how do you both, like, your business and trying to thrive during capitalism, but also trying to be community minded? And are there ways that people have experimented at the nexus of both? Is that what I'm hearing? Okay. So what comes to mind, there is a restaurant that I like in Austin called Nixta, and it's owned by, I think they're a couple. They do indigenous food ways. And one of the things that I love about them, their food is priced a little bit more, but partially why their food is priced so much is they have basically like every day they have it's not a refrigerator, so it's not like a community fridge, but they have like a pantry outside of their restaurant where they it's not leftovers. They create food just for the community and they put it out and anyone can take it. There's no, you don't even have to come into the restaurant or anything like that. And it's been interesting, especially, I moved to Austin during the pandemic, so it's been interesting watching some of these models thrive because actually a lot of people choose to patron that restaurant because of the work that they're doing. And I think it's really, I'm one of them. I think it's really incredible how they're doing that. Because I think you see some businesses who give away food that is left over at the end of the day, but that's not what they're doing. It's almost like they're sharing their first fruits too, and I think that's really incredible. So that's one thing that comes to mind. I think another thing that is not unique to like Black or people of color businesses, but I think I saw it thriving pretty well in Atlanta, was businesses sharing space, so that they could share the cost of the overhead and they could share staff, but they were two separate businesses. I saw that a lot, particularly around sharing commercial kitchens and sharing spaces where people could, make their goods. It's not easy to afford rental spaces. And so I think a lot of Black businesses that I admired in Atlanta were doing that together, figuring out a way to do that. So those are two examples that come to mind for me. Mm-hmm.
I don't really have a question. I have more of a comment. Just I'm a little tired, so I don't know if I'm going to be very coherent about it. But I really enjoyed hearing you talk about the aesthetic and how, like, when I think about aesthetics, I think about the five senses and then judgments made from these five senses. And this is really what makes us human, and that's what restores subjectivity and objectivity. When we've been objectified. And I just think that you're really onto something there, with restoring, creating food communities around delight, around joy, and around the senses, all five of them, because that's what sort of multinationals are taking away from us. And this is what, what's Mark Zuckerberg's latest thing, what's it called? The metaverse, right? There's only two senses that are solicited in this metaverse. We're like progressively our senses are being numbed so that we can be exploited. And I think that if you could do something, you are doing something with this aesthetic thing, and it's really, really powerful. And I'm going to be thinking about it a little bit more, but I'm just a little too tired to ask a question right now. But if you want to comment on any of that, I would love to hear.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think kind of a comment, part of a question too. I just, thank you first of all so much for everything, the format and the presentation, the style as much as anything. It just all came together really lovely. As I'm, thinking through, the title of your book is Black Food Geographies and evokes this idea of place and spaces and the spatiality of things. And I'm thinking through the kitchen and a public housing project, an historic sugar field in Texas, and moving across all these different places. I'm just wondering, from your sense, if you had any words about the evolution or the development of your thinking about place and space as you went through this, and how that kind of might fit into some of these ideas that you've shared with us.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you. So I'm an anthropologist by training, and when I was writing my dissertation, and I'm trying to do all this stuff, and anthropologists go places. We go places. We do research in a lot of places. What I would say, well, I don't know. Are there other anthropologists in the room? I don't want to offend anyone. It's okay. I'm going to say it anyway. We go places, but anthropologists don't usually think about place as an animated figure in what we're doing. It's like the backdrop of what we're doing. So when I was doing my work and my advisor was like, A, you're trying to do too much, and B, I think you're going to have to make a decision of whether or not you want to foreground people or place. And I was like, I don't understand this question. They go together, right? And she's like, sure, but if you ever want to finish this dissertation, one of them is going to have to go first. So I actually focused more on people in my dissertation, but this question around place was really bothering me. Like, I was like, there's an interaction here that really, I understood what she was saying, but I wanted to capture the interaction. So I started studying more geographers. I started reading a lot more geography. So I think one thing that has changed for me is I said this to the class I was in earlier, I really believe that we have to think about justice at multiple scales. And I think that comes from seeing at what registers things resonate with people. So for example, when I was doing research in DC, I would go, my major sites were community garden, a supermarket, and a small, what some people would call a corner store, in addition to being with people in their homes and all that kind of stuff. And the way people experienced that small corner store was very different from the way people were experiencing a supermarket. And some of that has to do with scale. That store was maybe 6,000 square feet compared to the supermarket. So I guess one of the things I would say is that when I went into my study, I was thinking about the different places as just distinct places. And where I am now is I look back on those places and think, oh, these are different scales too. And how people are interacting in these places is also a function of what behavior feels good and appropriate and right and true at different scales of experience relative to these places. So I think that has changed. I also think the other thing that's changed for me is I don't think that a place has to change permanently to be effective. So part of this is 2 of the places that I wrote about in Black Food Geography don't exist in the same way that they did before. So the small store, the owner died. They have leased the store to someone else. There's now bulletproof glass in the store that was never there before. And the community garden is not there anymore. And so I was devastated when both of these things changed. But where I'm now thinking is like, what if we didn't think of permanency and actually embraced the idea of the ephemeral as actually an asset? That like the lives and the changes that were being able to be impacted through that store and that community garden, they don't exist anymore, but it still set some changes in motion that were really important. So the gardeners, the garden, for example, doesn't exist. One of the gardeners moved to somewhere else, and the first thing he did was rally some other people and start a new garden. So there's almost a way that I'm trying to think about beauty and aesthetics and improvisation as things that travel and then they take place somewhere else. They don't have to be permanent. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your work and for your keen insight and perspective. I, for example, have enjoyed very much the way you have focused on culture when looking at issues around food, the way food circulates in a particular space or broader space, in a community, across history. And what I try to convey to my students, and in having used your work, is really the focus on social relationships and how that plays out in a very important way in the way we relate to food, in the way we connect to food, that we can't just talk about food in terms of consumption, in terms of acquisition, consumption, but also in terms of coming together around the table or across space, as your mother does by sending you cookies. So this aspect of delight, which is the social, the cultural, is so critical. And what I think you captured really well in Deanwood and then the surrounding communities, but especially in Deanwood, was really capturing this community in all its complexities and having them share their stories with you, making it very human. So I guess what I'm getting at is the humanizing aspect of your work is really significant. So if you could speak a little bit more how you try to come to that, because ultimately I think that's where we're going, which is this idea of food as a reflection of our humanity and how we relate to it and how we share it, how we imagine it, but as people and in social relations and in community. If you could just say a few more words about that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. So there's a story I often tell that I didn't tell tonight around how I got into this, and people, if you've read Black Food Geographies, I hint at it, but I was a middle school teacher before I went on to do my PhD. And I didn't grow up in city. I think this is important. I didn't grow up in a city. I didn't grow up in a town. I grew up in an unincorporated area that does not show up on a map outside of a small town. And I think that's important because when I moved to Atlanta to teach middle school, I had lived the majority of my life on a dirt road that was 3.2 miles long, right? Amongst mostly family on land that my family had inherited at emancipation because of all the things that you could think about when you have a great-great-great-grandfather who was a slave owner and gifts land to his illegitimate children. So, you know, that is the context in which I grew up. So when I went to teach middle school and my students had questions around grocery stores and supermarkets, particularly students that I had taken home with me to make dinner for them before I took them home. And they had questions that I didn't have an answer to because I hadn't even thought about cities in that way. I mean, I had only lived in a city maybe 4 years at that point, right? And so my town had 2 grocery stores. You went to one or the other. The question of access didn't make sense in the rural space in the way that it does in urban space. So I say that to say a lot of what orients me toward how I understand people's relationship to food and place started with listening to them tell me how they understood their relationship to food and place, particularly because they lived less than 5 miles from where I lived. So I was really curious about how they understood that. So I took up, the reason I study food is because 7th graders asked me questions I didn't have answers to. So that's the first thing. When I started doing work in Deanwood, like I said, I was interested mostly in trying to connect neighborhood, kitchen, eating, all of these different spaces. And sometimes people don't like to say this and admit to this, but when you're a qualitative researcher, a lot of things are also as much about your intuition as they are about the things that you're asking people and such. And so in the first 4 months, I was asking people questions. It wasn't getting me to where I wanted to go. And it was also this feeling of like, you know, I mentioned like people were cagey and not wanting to talk. So I shifted my questions and I started asking, tell me your favorite food story. And I started every interview that way. And if I pulled up transcripts right now, you would see most of the interviews, I kid you not, are 6-7 pages of people just talking about their favorite memory before I asked them anything about where they live now. And that created such a rich bond and relationship and point of shared connection that I think is one thing that comes throughout the book. I think another thing that I tried to do, and I think this is hard when you're a researcher because you have questions, but I think it's important, once I saw things were shifting, I just tried to follow the stories instead of trying to dictate the stories to go after the questions that I wanted to ask. And that felt really generative as well. And then in the structure of the book, as you can see, I tried to leave whole blocks of text intact rather than like insert myself into how people were talking. And that's pretty much how those texts show up in the transcript, people just talking. And so I tried to structure it where their stories were foregrounded and my analysis came second. That felt really important to me. I think what's shifting now, because so much of what I'm writing about is historical and I'm writing about people who are no longer alive, is I can't talk to the dead, right? I mean, I can, but it's not the same. Like, I can't sit on the porch and talk in the same way that I would with people here. So a lot of what I've been doing is like, there's the archival stuff and trying to put flesh on what I can find in the archives, right? If this person was a cook in 1910, what kind of restaurant might he have worked in? What kind of work might he have done? So just trying to like, it's very speculative in a way that is not the same, but it is also to try to humanize what they might have experienced. There's also the ways that I try to describe what it would have been like to have worked 14 to 17 hours a day cutting or planting or harvesting sugarcane and then have to walk a mile back to your camp to be fed food that were the leftovers from the day before that had been scraped into a bucket and reserved you. Right? So in that way, it's like recounting violence, but it is also reminding people that like no human being should have been treated this way, regardless of what they had done in the world. So I think those are some ways that I try to like bring out the human dimensions of food. And then also Black food geography, actually, there's so few meals in that book. And that's intentional in the sense that I wanted to foreground how people were talking about food more than what I observed of them in terms of engaging food. So
I'm afraid we're out of time.
Okay.
But again, thank you so much for
Yeah.
like sharing like your insights into your current thinking and also your process, the process behind that.
Thank you.
Again, thank you, Dr. Reese.